morning, everybody. So I hope you enjoyed the first day of the program and that it was informative. I think this is a very relevant topic, especially as at this very moment in the development of the network, some of these aspects will be very relevant. So next slide, please. Next one. So the first question I would have, and I hope that I can already engage you, and that's going to be a challenge at 8:30 in the morning. Next slide, please. So I listed a few things to consider that if you want to install governance, what would be a good reason for it? And I think, Jaja, you mentioned the first one quite accurately is, of course, you need to implement some policies and regulations for the biobank. I mean, it's not a personal thing. It's really, you should consider it a business, something to take very seriously. UGM is that the biobanking organization itself is only a custodian for the samples that the researcher delivers. So the organization itself needs to recognize that particular stakeholder. It's a very important voice to make sure that it's heard. And also they have the institution with certain interests. So also the institution needs to be heard. Then the fact is that it's very important to create transparency. What will be done with the samples? What can be done? What was done? And through governance you can create transparency. And transparency is an important element not only for researchers to provide samples to a biobank, but also for participants to participate in research with biobanks, because they need to be fully aware what happens with the samples, what happens with types of research, what is allowed, what's not allowed. What if I provide a sample and for instance you do some sort of a genetic analysis on it and you publish it, and it turns out that it's quite negative for me. I mean, that's something I want to know in advance. So governance can guide you there. And of course in the management of the LC aspects, the ethical, legal and societal impact, there the governance is crucial to have properly arranged. And the final result of all of this is trust between participant biobank, researcher biobank, institution biobank, and all these other aspects. Next slide, please. So there are some factors that you need to consider, and I've made a small division into external factors and internal factors. The first one, next slide please, is the national rules and regulations, or lack thereof. And I think that that is something quite well recognized here. So if you do a biobank and there are hardly any rules, do you think that this is a good thing or a bad thing? Any opinions? Could I have the second mic? Maybe I can just look for a volunteer to say something about that. You yourself have a collection.
Yes.
And
yes.
You need guidance, right? You need to know in advance what are you up to. The government needs to be clear on what can you do, what can't you do.
Yeah. Earlier, many researchers, they have the tissue, they have blood, but it is only in small research. Yeah. Sometimes not all the whole thing to make research provide before, and after research finished, they have tissue, they have blood. Sometimes the owner doesn't know what they have to do with the tissue after.
After the research is completed.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I think the governance must go inside for make a good structure in the biobank system.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. So then, what we typically see. Thank you for your contribution. General opinion towards genetics is an opinion of mistrust or anxiety. So it's very difficult if it's not properly regulated. Then you don't know what you can do or can't do. The same goes for privacy. It's a very important topic for biobanks, but what are the rules? And what if you do some interesting study on a topic that you feel like, well, maybe this is difficult because I don't know how to properly protect the privacy of the participant, but still I want to publish this. And so that's where you are more or less forced to have at least some rules and regulations. And then the last one is the need to reconsent. So a biobank typically will create a collection of samples with a consent to create samples for any type of research. But then in some countries, and my good neighbors in Germany, for instance, they have quite strict rules on reconsenting. So if you have a broad consent for doing a biobank, and then you want to do research on a particular subject, then in many cases you need to reconsent the participant. And you can understand, if you have a big collection like the German national cohort, they will have 150 to 200,000 participants. They should have 100 research projects a year. And you can't go back to your participant every time. But this is sometimes the rules, so you need to have that clear. Next slide, please. Then there's the institutional requirements. In the UMCG, and I'll show you the example later, is we have our own biobank regulations in the UMCG, which makes it, for us at least, manageable, so you know what you're up against. And of course, you have your institutional standard of operating, you have your protocols. If you look at, for instance, pathology samples, the surgeons work in a certain way, and you'll have to manage your biobank in that setting. You can't ask the surgeons to start operating differently. You can ask them to start recording things, to start working according to their own protocol. Maybe they are not so strict yet, but you can't say to them, you need to operate the patient differently. That's just not how it works. So you are faced with those standard operating procedures. Next slide. And then there's the cultural differences. This is something you can't influence. If you want to start a biobank in Indonesia, you're going to have to cope with the culture of Indonesia. The same for the Netherlands. We have to deal with our own culture. And I think there's a very interesting survey that was done, which was published in Nature actually by Gaskell and Goldweiss. And they showed that the public awareness of biobanks is a crucial matter. If you can inform your public about the fact that there are biobanks and what is the purpose of a biobank, that will lead to higher, higher participation. And also that will lead to the willingness to give broad consent. We're always looking for broad consent because we don't want to limit ourselves too much. But if the public doesn't know you, they won't give you that trust to give a broad consent. They will want to know exactly what you're going to do. So the broad consent is a very important thing, and it's only achieved through proper communication and public awareness of biobanks. So that was one of the things that they published about. And also, the trust in the government relates directly into the trust in biobanks. So the higher the trust in government, the higher the trust in biobanks are. So also there we are faced with an external factor because you can't influence it. Then what does the donor want? What does he expect? So in the Netherlands we have a very altruistic approach. In Lifelines there are 167,000 individuals, and at some point in time we started collecting feces, stool samples. And we didn't do that in the beginning, so we asked them after a while. And I would like to just ask you to give us an estimation, like how many % of people would do that? Give a stool sample, collect it at home. What do you think? How many? Start collecting a stool sample if you ask them to.
Asking the participant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it depend on the purpose.
Yeah, good point. It should
Yeah.
depend on the purpose. And if we have a good purpose.
Yeah, to repeat the question, I think if it is possible, can ask them one more time if it is possible. But if not, I think the researcher need to discuss what is a good way to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe, thank you. So, do you have a different opinion? What if they would ask, so you are a participant in a biobank. Please imagine you are participating in a biobank. A population-based biobank, very standard, and they collect blood samples and urine samples. You agree to this. And then all of a sudden they ask you to start collecting a stool sample, feces. Would you say yes?
Maybe
I'm going to give you one sneak peek. I would say no. Please.
It depends on, because actually if someone asks me to give my stool to him, I will ask what for.
Yeah.
Do I have the data?
Okay.
And do you will give my information to other people? Kind like this.
Yeah, good. Thank you, thank you. So in Lifelines we started collecting stool samples, and actually without giving any purpose, because they trust the organization, 85% of people provide a stool sample without giving explanation, just asking them, this is a new sample that we are now doing. At home you get your collection kit, and when you're home and you went to the toilet and you got your sample, you put it in your freezer, your home freezer, in a black bag, so I mean it doesn't look, you don't see it anymore, but so 85% of people do it. But that's not because we have a good relation with the participant, yes, but it's the Dutch mentality that offers the opportunity, otherwise it would not have happened. Then I am invited to as a consultancy job in a Chinese biobank. And there, one of the first things I said is, or they asked me is, how do we invite the participant to participate? I mean, what's in it for them? So I said, well, I mean, it's good for science. And I get this glazy look, like, what are you talking about? Then I say, well, they get a medical checkup, right? Because they go to the clinic, you analyze their blood, you do a physical examination. And he's like, well, we get that every year. So what's in it for the participant? So I was more or less out of arguments. So I said, well, maybe we should do it somewhere else. But that's something that we need to consider. What's in it for the donor? And we have to, that is something that we cannot influence. That's something that they have themselves. And also, what are their fears? Do they fear privacy? Do they fear genetics? That can be very far away from your own things. And then the last one is the opportunities to collaborate with industry. So that is also very much culture driven. Is it okay for scientists to interact with business, or is it frowned upon? Is it not really embraced? That's something we have to cope with. And then the last one, next slide, is the ethical considerations, and I think that is something that's very hard to define. So when you're designing your governance, this is something you'll need to consider. a key factor is the stakeholder representation. If you are building, for instance, like the UGM Biobank, you're building an institutional biobank, so you need to have institutional representation, you need to have representation of the donor, the investigators, the doctors, the ethics, the finance. I mean, they all have to be involved in some shape into this process. One of the benefits of having a proper governance is that you can distribute your workload a little bit. You ask some scientists if they want to participate in a board to evaluate proposals, and all of a sudden you don't have to do it yourself anymore, because they have opinions and they want to contribute. So it has some pluses. And the risk management aspect. So if you are by yourself deciding about a collection of samples, you may make some decisions that in hindsight you think, well, that's not very smart. But if you are in a group of scientists or a group of people, then of course you make better decisions. Next slide, please. Next one. So just to give you a few examples about what type of governance designs you can make, and also how we manage to always make things very complicated, simple things very complicated. So the first example is the UMCG. I think we have a good system, but it's quite complex, and I don't know if it's not something that is perfect. In the Netherlands we have the Code of Proper Use of Human Tissue, which is a sort of a recommendation made between institutions. It's not a law. We also have laws, the Dutch legislation. Then in the UMCG we have specific biobank guidelines, and they are always reviewed against the ethics framework that we work in. Next slide, please. So then all of that, and this is what we end up with. So I don't know if this is clear to you. Not everybody says yes right away. Okay. So this is how we put the biobanking organization within the UMCG. In the top you have the board of directors, and the board of directors have appointed a dean of research. The dean of research, of course, he has many important tasks. So one of the tasks is to delegate all his work to others. And he has appointed a professor to do the research data and biobanking. And that professor, of course, very important man, he also thought, well, I have to delegate all my activities. So he put in an expert team for medical data, an expert team for biobanking, and of course the bike center, which I work with. And so this is where within the organization you have your experts. Then there's an advisory council of biobanking and a research IT platform for biobanking, which is supportive to the staff. And in the bottom there you see Lifelines as one of the largest research infrastructures in the Netherlands, but still in the hierarchy it is actually quite low. So this is an example of the Dutch of the UMCG way. Next slide, please. Then I thought I also give an example of a different university medical center, and I have a new complexity here, because this is just to show you how